Fat adaptation is trending. Train low, race fast, ditch the gels. You've heard it. Your training partner swears by it. There's a podcast about it, and some guy's probably yelling about it on Twitter right now. And to be clear, some of the advice isn't inherently wrong. It's just when we look at it from a competitive pressure idea, it doesn't land. So if you're training for a marathon and someone has convinced you that cutting the carbs will improve your race performance, the research doesn't support that. Not even close. So in fact, the most rigorous studies ever done on elite athletes show a 7 to 8% performance gap between carb-fueled and keto-adapted athletes at the same fitness level, in the same training camp, running the same race. So here's what we're going to cover today. A bit of the biochemistry of why your muscles require carbohydrates in the first place at race-based intensity, and what the science actually shows about low carb for endurance performance, including the study that most keto advocates don't talk about, and the practical fueling framework for your long runs and race day with specific numbers that you can all apply to each of your long runs. I'm Brant Stachel, former national team running coach, registered psychotherapist, and mental performance coach. I've coached more than 150 athletes at Boston qualifiers and over 24 international teams representing Canada. And so this is the lens that I pull from when I'm providing this information. Before we go any further, I've put together a free race day nutrition and fueling guide. I know it feels like I'm selling you something. I'm not. It's completely free. You just download it. I've tried to make it as awesome as possible. It maps directly everything we're going to cover today. It has a weight-based carb table for the day before and race morning. And it's the exact resource that I use with my own athletes, all the way from 212 marathoners to trail athletes going after 100 milers. The link's in the description, and also in the description is a marathon readiness survey. It takes on average a minute 46 to complete, and it helps you actually understand what it takes to be ready, and it gives me some answers about what content that I can actually be making that is relevant to you to where you're at in your training. Both free. Please grab them. So let's start with the physiology and why your muscles actually demand carbs. From a biochemistry perspective, this is where the low carb argument starts to break down almost entirely. Your body has two primary fuel sources during running: carbohydrates, that is stored as glycogen in your muscles and liver, and fat. And the critical detail that rarely makes it into social media posts is fat and carbohydrate are not interchangeable at race pace intensity. Fat oxidation has a hard ceiling, and it maxes out at roughly 60 to 65% of VO2 max. And marathon pace for most trained runners sits well above that. So thinking about that mechanism, burning fat requires approximately 8% more oxygen per unit of ATP produced than burning carbohydrate does. It's a fancy way of saying it requires more oxygen to burn more fat than carbs. So at easy effort, that gap doesn't really matter all that much. Oxygen delivery is adequate, but at marathon pace or higher intensities, you're operating close to your aerobic ceiling. So every breath has to work as efficiently as possible for performance. Fat simply cannot deliver the same power output per unit of oxygen that carbohydrate can. So carbohydrate is your high octane fuel. Fat is the backup generator that keeps the lights on. It cannot run the engine at race speed. So what happens when your glycogen runs out? Your body can't sustain marathon pace on fat alone. Pace drops, perceived effort spikes, legs go heavy. This is what most of you have had where you can describe hitting the wall at mile 20. It's not a mental failure. It's not a fitness failure. It generally is a biochemical event. Muscle glycogen is depleted, blood glucose is falling, and the body is unable to maintain the energy output the pace demands. So you've probably heard this before, but your muscle glycogen stores roughly enough for 90 to 120 minutes of hard running. For a 4-hour marathoner, that means glycogen becomes a limiting factor around miles 13 to 15 without fueling. So for a 3-hour marathoner, their problem arrives even earlier because they're working at a higher percentage of VO2 max and burning through glycogen faster. Typically, but not always. And so the wall isn't a myth, it's actually just math. So what does the research actually say on this low carb debate? I've watched this for years. I've seen it at high levels. I've watched some of these studies. I've seen the discourse on X, Twitter, whatever it's called about it. And I'm going to try to break it down without being overly rigid and using scientific terms and breaking down studies, but more to look at it from a competitive performance and what the athletes at a high level are actually doing to try and get better. Because I think that's where the rubber meets the road. It's great to say something in a study, but what are elite athletes doing whose contracts and money and careers rely on actually getting this right? So let's give the low carb argument a fair shake before we tear it apart, because it's not completely without merit. The logic goes like this. If you train your body to burn more fat efficiently, you can tap into your essentially unlimited fat stores and reduce dependence on glycogen. Since you can't run out of fat the way you can run out of glycogen, the wall becomes less of a threat. The theory is coherent. The problem is what actually happens when you test it on competitive athletes at race pace. And so this is where I want to enter the Project Supernova. So this was one of the most rigorous series of studies ever conducted on low carb and ketogenic diets, specifically in elite endurance athletes. So it was led by this amazing professor, Louise Burke, with nearly 40 years of experience as the head of sports nutrition at the Australian Institute of Sport, which is one of the best institutes of sport around the world. The Supernova studies recruited world-class endurance athletes, Olympic medalists, world champ medalists, etc. In their studies, it was quite insane what they did. They controlled every gram of food they consumed over 3 to 4 weeks and had them compete in official sanctioned races, not time trials, not on a treadmill, not out for a run measuring effort, sanctioned races. And so here's what the Supernova study found. In the original paper, part 1, published in the Journal of Physiology, I think it was in 2017, athletes were assigned to one of 3 diets. They had high carb availability, periodized carbohydrate, or ketogenic, low carb, high fat. And so what that was less than 50 grams of carbohydrate per day. Think about that for a second. That is very low amount of carbohydrate. All 3 groups improved their aerobic capacity equally during the training period. And then they raced. The high carb group improved their 10-kilometer race performance by about 6.6%. The periodized carb group improved by about 5.3%. And the keto group showed 0 improvement in performance, despite equal gains in fitness. Why? Think about what we said before. That same 8% oxygen cost problem. Keto-adapted athletes could burn more fat. They're right, but it's at the cost of the economy. They needed more oxygen to run at the same speed at the race intensity, and this is the critical liability. Burke's team replicated the entire study in 2020 and published in PLOS 1 specifically to address criticisms of the original. And so the results were reproduced in a new cohort of new elite athletes. The low-carb, high-fat diet substantially increased fat oxidation, with an associated increase in the oxygen cost of exercise and reduced economy. The performance gap held to their first study. A third Supernova study, published in the Journal of Physiology in 2021, found that even 5 to 6 days of adaptation to a low-carb, high-fat diet increased the oxygen cost of exercise by 5 to 8% at race speeds. And switching back to a high-carb diet for 24 hours before the race did not fully reverse the damage. Even if you train it and then add carbs the day before, it doesn't reverse the damage. Subsequent Supernova variations testing the carbohydrate reintroduction on race days, ketone ester supplementation, still showed that athletes had an 8% performance differential in favor of the carb group. Fat adaptation is real. It does happen within 3 to 4 weeks at low intensities. Easy runs, base building. It has a legitimate place in periodized training approach at the highest levels. The problem is that marathons are not run at low intensity. Marathon pace for the trained runner sits at 75 to 85% of VO2 max. This is exactly the range where carbohydrates become the decisive fuel. And so the moment the intensity crosses the fat oxidation ceiling, there's no metabolic workaround. So the big topic lately has been in-race fueling. And so here's some of the mechanisms and the numbers. We've established why carbohydrates are non-negotiable for performance. So let's talk about how to actually use them. During a marathon or a long run, I have most of my athletes, and we're seeing this in all endurance sports, triathlon, cycling, trail, road. Everybody is pushing 80 to 100 grams almost as a floor now of carbohydrate per hour. And so for training runs, we want to start training that gut to be able to do that. So these are not conservative suggestions. They represent the upper end range of what we know the gut can absorb when properly trained. The key here is what we're finding in the research and applied listening to athletes is that a glucose to fructose ratio matters more than most runners realize. That means you can't just take anything in. You want glucose and fructose because they have different intestinal transporters. So if you're a bit of a nerd, like I am sometimes, SGLT1 for glucose and GLUT5 for fructose. Using only glucose products maxes out one transporter at about 60 grams per hour. Add fructose at roughly a 1 to 0.8 ratio, and you activate both transporters simultaneously. And this is what we're starting to see unlock those absorptions rate up to and above 90 to 120 grams per hour. And so this is why the specific ratio in your gels and drinks matter. Not just that your gel or drink has a lot of carb. And this is what I talk about in my fueling guide, which I referenced before. And so if you enjoyed this and you're trying to learn more, download the guide. It gives you like weight by weight, day by day before, everything. So it's free. You can grab it below. The most common objection I hear when I talk to athletes, whether it's at the pro level or the amateur level, is I can't take gels. They wreck my stomach. That is almost always a training problem, not a carbohydrate problem. And what I mean by that is when we look at the literature, Studies show that upward 30 to 90%, I know it's a big gap, but 30 to 90% of endurance athletes experience GI issues during competition. And the primary cause for that is not practicing your fueling and training and trying something new on race day. Your gut is highly adaptable if you train it. Those intestinal transporters can upregulate with repeated exposure. Absorption will improve, but only if you train it consistently. Taking a gel for the first time at mile 8 of a marathon, not a gut training protocol, not a recipe for success. So start fueling on every long run. Your race day gut will be an entirely different system. Most questions that follow up with that when I talk to athletes is like, well, when should I start? I generally like to go 30 to 45 minutes into your long run rather than waiting until you feel depleted. Hunger signals and fatigue signals arrive approximately 20 minutes after the biochemical need for fuel begins. But this is why we want to start fueling early and often. So it doesn't actually matter how many gels you have, it matters how many grams of carbohydrate per hour. And every gel is different. This is why you need to practice and you need to look at your gels accordingly. For a lot of people, I might have them fuel every 20 minutes because they're trying to break that down into 4 20-gram gels or half a gel of a 40-gram gel every 20 minutes. This isn't just like an optimal strategy. It's probably the difference between running mile 22 super fast and picking up and surviving it. A practical protocol I use with my athletes to get them ready day before a race to the finish line. We'll start at the timeline here, the day before. Carb loading, we know it works, but most people go overboard. You don't need 5 days of pasta. The research supports a compressed window of 1, max 2 days before the race. And you want to target 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. So a 70 kilogram runner is aiming for 560 to 840 grams in a single day. So that requires intentional planning. Trust me, when I've done this, I'm taking high carb drinks the day before to try and hit my numbers. So you have to be very intentional about this. It's not just a bigger dinner. It's not just rice or pasta or bread, at dinner the night before. You want to keep it also to foods your gut knows. Keep fat and fiber low. So that helps with both slow gastric emptying, which means lower glycogen loading and a higher GI risk on race day. The exact numbers by body weight are in my guide. Fast forward to race morning. Carbohydrate rich breakfast 3 to 4 hours out before the race. Low in fat and fiber as well. Oatmeal, banana, honey, a bagel with jam, all good options. I would encourage you though to practice this in your long runs so it's not something new on race day. So the 3 to 4 hour window tends to give your gut time to clear, blood glucose to stabilize before the gun goes off. If your race starts early and a 4 hour window isn't possible, like some major marathons, a smaller, simpler meal 2 hours out can also work, but you just need to reduce the volume accordingly. The pre-race carb table in the guide gives you a specific gram targets based on body weight for that meal as well. So in race, depending on, some people like to take a gel in the 20 to 30 minutes before, some people like to take it in the first 20 to 30 minutes. I don't care which one you do, but fuel early and often and put yourself on a cadence that you've practiced and put yourself on a cadence that allows you to get 80 to 100 grams per hour. One way to think about it is that every gel is a deposit into your energy account. Every sip of a high carb or water is a reset, and the runners who hit the wall at mile 20 didn't run out of fitness. They probably ran out of fuel or had a pacing problem. And fueling is not a crutch. It is the strategy that we are starting to see more and more runners use to become super successful at long endurance running. If you want to know whether your overall training approach, including nutrition, is setting you up for race goal, I have a marathon readiness assessment. It takes you 1 minute and 46 seconds, I think is the last average. It's in the description. It will help you understand where you're at. It also helps me know where athletes are actually lacking so I can make content that's tailored for you guys so you can understand how best to perform on race day. So there you have it. There's a fairly deep dive, a decently full picture of why carbohydrates are biochemically irreplaceable at race pace intensity, what the most rigorous research on low carb performance actually shows, and how to fuel on race day. If this was useful, a like or a subscription really helps the algorithm, I've been told. So if it wasn't or I missed something, drop it in the comments. I read them and answer them. Happy training.